Carlton, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually really majors on geopolitics, because geopolitics is the glue for all of those other areas which I've just mentioned. Today, unlike normal, I'll be performing this in isolation. That means I won't have with me my sidekick or podcast wife Fergus, but I'll be doing it on my own because it's a critical thinking episode. And what I'm going to dive into are the recent events that happened in the Russian Federation in Russia. So why am I doing this? Well, first and foremost, because quite a few individuals have contacted me and they said, a few listeners, subscribers who generally subscribe, what they want to do is actually get my feel on what actually happened over the weekend that's just gone. So we're looking at, today is the 27th, so the last weekend that's just gone. So the 27th of June 2023 we're talking about. So they wanted my feel on it. So first and foremost, what I have to do is give a health warning. And that health warning is quite simple. I am not mentioning anything that I know of as fact from government. So my former colleagues, when it used to be the Special Branch, now it's a body in Scotland Yard called the Counter-Terrorism Command, which I always thought was kind of limited because the Special Branch dealt with all political offences. So that was great, and it did what it said on the tin. The Counter-Terrorism Command sounds as though you only deal with countering terrorism and nothing else. So this would be something that would come under potential for official secrecy. And so therefore what I say is, what I'm saying is all my opinion, so it's not a secret, so therefore I would in no way, shape or means be subject to the draconian Official Secrets Act that is legislatively in play within the United Kingdom. So what I'm basically saying to you is, I don't know. I'm just guessing on the basis of my experience what may or may not have happened, and my observation and analysis, which is what I always do. So really what we're talking about is this guy, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Now, I'm not a Russian speaker. I must admit, I tried to learn the language myself, to self-teach myself it in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and as a result, I found myself arrested as a spy at Checkpoint Charlie in West Berlin, going into East Berlin, but that's another story. So we won't bother going there today. But yeah, so I never really got to the level whereby I was a great Russian speaker in any way, shape or means. So I say that because what I'm trying to do already is really say to people, forget my pronunciation of the names. Also, obviously, his group's called the Wagner group, and I'm saying that as a German pronunciation. The obviously there's going to be some sort of Russian pronunciation of the Wagner group as well, which I will have messed up there. So let's get to the gist of the matter and what happened last weekend. My thoughts are actually quite simple. I think it's like with most things, actually, there's never one simple answer, never one simple solution or suggestion. I mean, as I said before in the last Critical Thinking, I actually explained that the first victim of war is truth. And I mean, I have frankly never seen it so bad in the West that we are commentating on the news media, and that's mass circulation news. There's a few stations, or really the YouTube stations, that give you a better view of the truth, or give you a more than one-sided perspective of what's going on. But I think if you look in the West in general, there's a totally one-sided perspective. We hate Russia, we want Russia to be defeated, and anything that the Ukraine says is the truth. And by the way, I would imagine, I don't know, but I would suggest from experience that psychological operations are being carried out and the publics in the West are being fed from the intelligence and security agencies what they should think and feel and what it's all about. Militarily, I think there are going to be, and I'm not a military historian or military specialist in any way, shape or means. I have some knowledge of what the military do due to my 30 years work in those fields, and my first work was actually for the American military. But frankly, I don't profess to be a militarian in any way, shape or means. But what I would say is that even I can see that what is being said militarily about the armies of the Russian Federation and about NATO and about the Ukraine is absolutely, from a Western mass media perspective, one-sided and frankly senseless. And at some stage, when it goes wrong, and I believe it still will, even despite what happened over the weekend, indeed, I'm suggesting that the weekend was probably a show of lack of capacity for the Ukrainian rather than a show of strength for the Ukrainian. Now, I'm not saying that Putin was strong on the issue, but I'll explain as I go along why I think this is the case. So, Wagner, and why did they try this stunt? I can only put it that way. I'm hearing that already on Wednesday, particularly within the United States, that there was some feel about something that was going to go on. Now, you can listen to several commentators who have brought this up, and indeed, even at the White House questions, various reporters have brought up why was it that what's euphemistically known in the United States as the Gang of Eight, who are the individuals in Congress who are informed about what's going on and have the high-risk clearances because they're on the Armed Forces Commission Board. So they are meant to be informed about covert actions and activities that are undertaken by the military or the intelligence and security agencies before things happen. So apparently there was such a meeting on Wednesday. Now, that meeting could have been about anything. But the suggestion is from people in the know that it wasn't, and that there was some knowledge, pre-knowledge of something that might have gone on or might be about to go on. I would also say that, as our Prime Minister said, that we are constantly watching to see what the war in Ukraine means for the unity of the Russian Federation. Now, he let that slip in BBC interview with Laura Kunzberg. And indeed, he said it 3 or 4 times that that's what we are doing. Now, that could mean, of course, quite rightly, that the agencies were just looking at what it might mean. It may also mean that there's an activity going on, and I would suggest there is activity going on by the agencies to try and get as many agents, and as people of this show should already know, that agents are people who we are trying to gain intelligence from and are sources or assets of intelligence that have been turned by the agencies. Now, some people go a step further than that and say that the whole thing was orchestrated. Oftentimes they seem to be pushing it towards my old firm of the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, that it was orchestrated and with obviously CIA assistance. And the reason why one commentator said that in particular is because he felt they wouldn't have been able to get it through the Congress so quickly, but that our systems were different, and therefore ours, by that I mean the United Kingdom, and therefore that it could function much quicker than the United States could, and so therefore the CIA was giving assistance. I would argue that the CIA would be central to any sort of activity like this and not just assistance, but it was led by the Secret Intelligence Service, by SIS. Who knows? All I would say is that, yes, it would be an ideal perspective to get Prigozhin on side, i.e. to make him an agent, or at least have influence over him, particularly because the Wagner group has been so active in the war-fighting situation in Ukraine, and this is the big bit, and what is known is that before last week, Wagner was given an ultimatum by the and I think it came, directly from the Russian president himself, from Putin, Russian Federation president, that Wagner fighters now had to sign affiliation to the Russian military proper. Now, what we probably need to do is go a little bit back into Wagner and see why it was produced, as far as I understand it. The reason why I believe Wagner was put in place, it's not like a private army, which you could go back into the times of the East India Company or the West India Company, or any of those that have their own private armies, which, were private armies, but nevertheless orientated the state. So Clive of India, his private armies in India, they take India privately, and then the British Army has to come into a system when they start getting knocked down. Same happened in East Africa, same happened in other areas. So sometimes private armies are the, if you will, the spear of an activity, and then government has to come in behind them. I saw a little bit of that in Blackwater. Clearly a lot of US governmental support behind it, but they were private soldiers, and so therefore, some might say mercenaries, and therefore when they die, it's not a problem because the system doesn't need to account for them in the same way they'd have to account for soldiers. And politicians aren't held to account for their deaths in the same way. These are fellows who get well paid to do a job of work. If they get killed, well, that's part of the contract. So in some ways, that is kind of what the Wagner group was like. But I think it's different. I would say that Wagner is more like the French Foreign Legion, that it's full of what you could perceive to be Russian patriots or individuals who have put forward a patriotic perspective to fight on behalf of Russia. So in the Foreign Legion, you get that. You get people from anywhere and everywhere, but they fight for the glory of France. Yeah, they get paid, but they're not paid, the exorbitant amount of monies that, example, Blackwater or other groups are being paid in Afghanistan or Iraq to do protection work or whatever it might be. No, they're getting paid, but the vestige of control somewhere along the line sits within the state of France. Now, Wagner, I believe, is exactly the same. As I understand it, somewhere along the line, the GRU are in charge, and then from the GRU, its control comes from which is why it's the GRU rather than the SVR. So the control then is by the Russian military. Now, again, as I understand it, the reason why this was the case is that after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, or some could call it a coup, and it seems to be that there was a action carried out by the United States, by that the CIA, to overthrow the pro-Russian government and bring in a less than pro-Russian government into the Ukraine, and that was worked through in terms of regime change by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. I mean, I think that now has kind of been accepted by most. So again, look up, see where you are with it, and understand that. There may or may not have been some European Union assistance to that in terms of NATO rather than European Union in itself. But this all comes back to the idea that the Ukraine should be able to choose whether it wants to be in the EU, whether it wants to be in NATO, etc., etc. But you were going to have to go back to the original agreements after the fall of East Germany and the unification of Germany and the promise, and I think it's factual, and I think Jack Straw said it very clearly as well, that it is factual, Jack Straw being the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom at the time, that an agreement was made that NATO would not step one step past Germany, which was then unified. In other words, all of the old Warsaw Pact countries would not become part of NATO. They have. And so there was always going to be a clash between NATO and the Russian Federation in time to come. So taking that into account, I think we can easily say that the conflict has continued on to, generally from a NATO perspective in the first instance, to make sure Russia is surrounded and hemmed in. And this is why there are many ex-intelligence agency officers, I should say, probably better to put it that way, many ex-military in the United States who have stated very loud and clear that the actions of the US government is causing and was always going to cause a problem with the Russian Federation. That the Russians could not allow themselves to be encircled, particularly from the east and particularly taken into Ukraine as well, to have most of its landmass covered by NATO. So this has been one of the problems, and I think, there's several people who mentioned this. I'm not talking low-level individuals, I'm talking individuals, who were in the know in the US military, industrial and intelligence complex, who are aware of this. And so it's not a surprise that Putin saw this as an existential threat to the Russian Federation and therefore hoped to game his way, and I've said this a year and a half ago, so I'm not saying anything new, game his way to a buffer zone in the eastern states of what was the Ukraine. And the reason why I'm saying what was the Ukraine, and this is why I'm bringing it all together now, is because the areas that were the eastern part of the Ukraine and are now taken by the Russian Federation have now been ceded fully, as far as Russia's concerned, into the Russian Federation, which is why it was suggested that the Wagner group could no longer fight in those regions because they would be fighting as a quasi-private army, of course with deniability, on Russian Federation soil. And that is against the laws of the Russian Federation. So therefore it had to be an army perspective once the land has been taken, and a decision has been made, and as we know that these areas were given the vote, and these areas have said that they wanted to be part of the Russian Federation. It's understandable why they would. They lost 14,000 people up to the special military project being carried out. For once in the West, that'll be the invasion of the Ukraine. And I said from day one, so I'll put my cards on the table, that the interest of the Russian Federation was solely to take these eastern regions, or to have those eastern regions as neutral, and indeed to have the Ukraine as neutral. Because if you can remember, there were agreements made that would be the case. The Minsk agreements, which were not followed through, was a suggestion that basically what would happen is that they'd come to an agreement. In that agreement perspective was that actually those eastern regions wouldn't be taken. Crimea would be kept. It's 99% Russian. It would be kept. And more importantly, it's got the Black Sea ports there. So they didn't want to let that go out of the way. So that was a given. That was never going anywhere. That was going to stay, as far as Russia was concerned. But the outward regions to the east, they were willing to do some sort of deal and have them in kind of some sort of autonomous regions, like, I say, the Basque, or like Scotland even, in the United Kingdom, of its own quasi-government, but still under the control of Greater Ukraine. That's now gone. Understand, that is now gone. The Russian Federation cannot lose, who knows, 100,000 soldiers to give back what they fought for. That's never going to happen. So therefore, what the Ukraine now have to having lost, who knows, estimates 300,000 soldiers, maybe more, maybe less. What the Ukraine now, having had those losses, has got to now bite on and accept the fact that those regions are now gone and that they're now part of the Russian Federation. So Wagner, where's this come into play? So what you get now is you get then this perspective of, if you will, Wagner as we now see it being consumed into the Russian military. Obviously its leader then losing his power fully over the Wagner group, and then thinking to himself, what do I do? What's next? Now, I can see within that any self-respecting intelligence agency who is aiding and assisting a war. By the way, what I will say is we didn't have to take any part in this war at all. And the way we have oriented our public to this war is to a much greater degree than we did to the invasions that we undertook in both Afghanistan and Iraq. We were physically involved in actual combat, as our soldiers were involved, our sailors were involved, our airmen and women were involved in actual combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, day in, day out, for 10, 15, 20 years. And over that period of time, there was nothing like the propaganda pushed out by our military complexes to suggest that everything we're doing is correct. There was nothing like the idea that, it's a war and we've got to be involved. We're meant not to be fighting in this conflict. But of course, there's a greater interest taken in. Sometimes when I used to go and come back from Afghanistan or come back from Iran, where I used to be practically every other month, either one place or the other, I used to come back and I used to think, the country has zero interest in these conflicts. Over all those years, none, zero interest. Nobody cared. Nobody was interested. But with this one, they've got the interest by saying it's Europeans. And in some ways, I question how they're putting it together. You know, you'll have on the media example, nasty Russians, they've blown up a housing facility, let's say, some type of high-rise, and 2 people have died. They'll say 2 people, a woman and a child have died. This is terrible. Look, the United States probably has some individual shooting up a school or a mall or a workplace, and they kill 20, 30, 40 of their colleagues and injure many of their colleagues every day in comparison to the deaths that civilians are coming across in the Ukraine. So we can't put that in anything like the context. And I will tell you that in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was nothing like the lack of collateral damage, as it's called, i.e. people who are not combatants being killed, that there is by the Russians. So the Russians did not come in with shock and awe. They did not blow up every facility that could in any way, shape or means perform any damage to the soldiers invading that country, if we use the word invasion. They did not. In no shape, way, it means did they do that. In fact, what I said on my first critical thinking on this issue, I said that actually Putin's actions has been very, 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 very carefully carried through. He's not blowing up people left, right and centre. Yes, they are grinding out the deaths of Ukrainian soldiers. There is no doubt in that. Absolutely, they've been dying en masse, but not generally the civilians. So why we don't tell the truth on, well, I know why we don't tell the truth because it's psyops, but why the media, which is meant to be above psyops, doesn't tell the truth about the war in that context. I'll tell you what, you've had many, 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 many more dead in the Sudan than in the Ukraine in terms of civilians. Many, many, many more. So this is contextualising the situation. Now, and the reason why I mention this is, will this now be the case? Because what the West isn't mentioning with Prigozhin's activities, the reason why he is saying, in addition to the fact that he would lose power, which he's not mentioning, but the reason why he is saying that he has carried out this, whatever it might be, coup, is that he wanted to impress upon the Russian people that the Ministry of Defence is not propagating this war properly. And the way he wanted to propagate this war was to exterminate all those who are against Russia taking charge. In other words, to carry out shock and awe, to blow up buildings en masse, to go in and take out the major control and command systems of Russia, of the Ukraine. Take them all out, like what we did in Afghanistan. To have the leadership running around. You didn't see Saddam Hussein on TV every 2 days saying this is what I want to do, or travelling to various capitals or whatever. No, because they hunted him down like a dog. That's what we were doing, hunting him down like a dog, right? Not letting him roam around doing what he wanted to do. So the Russians have not done that. Why? Because, as I said in my first critical thinking, they have no intention on copying what we did in Iraq, or in Afghanistan, which 20 years later comes home to roost, that when you take on an insurgency, you have to either go all out for it, as we did after the Second World War, and keep 1 million men, as we did in Germany, for decades, or you have to not take them. So taking Western Ukraine for Russia is absolutely negative. That is not what the Russians want to do, because they'll end up fighting Ukrainians who believe in Ukrainian nationality. And yes, I will say it, fanatical neo-Nazis within the Ukrainians who believe in Ukrainian nationality. No, what he wants to do, and has achieved already, is take over those areas that are controlled primarily and to the vast extent by Russian-speaking Ukrainians who actually are happy to be within the Russian Federation. That's basically what he's wanted to do. And I said this from day one, so I'm not being a klugscheißer after the event, for those who understand German. What I'm saying is that this is what he wanted to do. Slowly, just take those and leave what he, I believe, wished to have was a neutral western part of the Ukraine. Or, in fact, originally, as I said to you before, he was happy to have Lugansk and all those other areas taken within Ukraine, but working autonomously. Now that's gone, and now he wants to just take them and have the rest of the region neutral a la Austria. And I tell you what, he'd live with that all day long. And indeed, this is what many Brits probably don't know, an agreement was made to that extent about 2 weeks into the special military operation, as he's called it, or the invasion, whichever way you want to call it. And it was our own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, no doubt with the wishes and assistance and agreement of the United States President, who went in and said, and the reason why he did it is twofold. One, and this is what some people want, Brexit. Yes, you heard me say it, Brexit. So the UK actually being important again. So how can we be important? Let's get ourselves involved in Ukraine. So Johnson went out. And number two, as what again would be utilised as some sort of distraction, or Ablenkung, if you want to keep the German running, from actually Johnson's wars, which he had at the time in Partygate. So really, you've had, 400,000 people die, soldiers die, as a result of Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, trying to take the heat off Partygate. Okay? So that's to do. Now, what is the wider US principle on that? I think the wider US principle is quite simple. Russia is an enemy, is still perceived as an enemy, and if we can keep them fighting in a long war, it degrades their capacity. Now, I said on that original one, mistakes have been made by Putin to invade, and mistakes have been made by the United States to basically illegally steal, I'm using that word, the Russian Federation money and throw them out of SWIFT. Because what that said to me was, the moment that was done, and I said, look back to that original one I did over a year ago. I said it at the time, this will make every country, even some allies, think, hang on, if we come up against the United States for whatever reason, we are potentially have our money frozen within US banks and any dollars that we have frozen. And secondly, we get thrown out of a system that allows us to trade, i.e. SWIFT system. So let's create something different. That's what I said at the time, right? What has that difference been? It's been BRICS expansion. Because even Saudi Arabia has seen that. So Saudi Arabia has looked around and said, hang on, they're trying to force us to do something on this Ukrainian issue. They've alienated the whole of Africa, by the way. Now you can turn around and say Africa doesn't matter. Probably doesn't right now, but everybody knows it will in the future. So you've alienated the Africans by basically saying, we must fight against this war against the Russians and stop the Russians doing that. Not taking into account the Africans that have been fighting every other day and losing way, way, way more people in terms of civilians than have been ever lost in the Ukraine, having way more devastation, having people starving day in, day out. Nothing was done to say, oh, let's undertake something on behalf of Africans. Let's look after them. Let's make sure that they're taken care of. Let's allow African people into our countries. Let's give them homes. Let's give them opportunities. Oh, poor Africans. You had people who, I can remember Clive Myrie example, I'll give you a good example of it. I can remember Clive Myrie, who was sat in the Sudan in front of literally hundreds of mothers who had no milk in their breasts and couldn't feed their children, and their children had been dying in front of him, and he's done reports and his eyes were absolutely and totally dry. Yet still, in the first weeks of the Ukrainian situation, when plump babies and children, etc., were being put onto trains and moved into other parts of the West, taking, 4 hours max, even if that, into Poland, it's an hour and a half, depending on where you were, right? And then being put up by the Poles, being put up by the Romanians, being put up by various others and looked after well, and Clive Myrie's crying. So the reality is that Africans see this, and I tell you, it's not me just saying it. You can look on the internet and you hear it all the time. They say, why is it when we are dying, no problem from the West, nobody demanding anybody to do anything, but when somebody dies in Europe, all of a sudden it's these people look like us, we need to do something about it. And the last time I looked, Europe wasn't inhabited by one type of looking people, of one hue. Definitely not the United States, when at least 15% and add another 20% of people with a lighter hue but not black are involved. So that's nearly 25% to 30% of the population does not look like Ukrainians, the average Ukrainian. Why should it be in the United States news that they're saying these people we must help above and beyond everybody else? So this sort of what can only be spoken about as prejudice and racism has done the United States no favours and has put China definitely in the front seat on this issue, and indeed has even put Russia on the front seat on this issue. So what we're getting now is a split between Europe and, by means, not all of Europe. You're having people like Hungarians speak out and say, why would we be fighting against Russia? Why would we indeed wish to cause some sort of problem, some strife with China? Why would we want to do that? So that's the Hungarians speaking out. And there are others speaking out, but somewhat quieter. So what I'm saying is, I feel that this whole issue can bring about the end of NATO. not bring NATO to strength. So this is now why NATO is fighting this war to its final conclusion, because it can see its end if it doesn't win. Now, what's winning? It can't win. The Ukraine cannot win this conflict unless, of course, NATO steps in and actually carries out the actions itself. And that, my friend, would lead to World War III. We nearly had World War III when Cuba put nuclear missiles on its land. Was not doing any challenge, was not saying that it was going to fight the United States, was not doing anything for its own defence, you could argue. But that was sufficient, because it was close to the borders of the United States, for the US to see as an existential threat. And to this day, that is still the same. That doctrine has not changed. So why should the doctrine be any different for the Russian Federation? You see, what I always did when I was in both areas, secret intelligence or national security, I always wanted to look at the other man or woman's perspective. This is our perspective, what is theirs? Because that's the only way you can understand. And a good officer does that. So the reality is why should Russia accept this? It won't. So we come back now to the original question. Why Prigozhin had marched on or rolled on, because they're on transport, Moscow? Well, there's been suggestions, and I know not whether this is true, so I put that out there, that already there was meant to be some assistance offered in Moscow if his troops would have got that far, and if they'd have taken some of the main military areas in Moscow. It's said that this was done in conjunction with the Ukrainians, hence the original speech from Putin at the weekend. Because apparently he understood that. Now, apparently there was arrests by the FSB of individuals trying to set up some sort of system. Again, we'll only know when this comes out in the wash. So that was that aspect. The other aspect that I mentioned earlier on, was he turned to be an agent for the West, which is what was being suggested by Putin, that Prigozhin had been turned to be an agent. Now, you don't need to turn the main man. You never do. All you need to do is turn people close to him, people who have his ear. My assessment of your man is, and one of the fundamentals in intelligence service is when you try to obtain an agent, you've always got to look at is what is the individual who is going to be your agent, what is the reason for becoming an agent? Why would they do it? Why would they become your asset? What is in it for them, or what do they think they can get out of it? And obviously there are quite a few things. One, obviously, is money. Two is people have been slighted often and thought they should have got a better crack at the whip than they did. But one of the great things is the fact that an individual just thinks himself to be, or herself, to be a bigger player than others have provided them with the tools to be. By that I mean somebody has undermined their capacity to actually really show what they've done. So you can imagine that the biggest part of this fight, particularly in Bakhmut, has been that Wagner and Prigozhin running the show has taken the battle to the Ukrainians. And in fierce fighting which generally takes the toll stronger on the attacker than it does on the defender, but in this case, I think he said he lost about 30,000 men, but we know that the Ukrainians has lost about 70,000 men, so therefore the training skills, capacity, fighting power, motivation, all of which has been said to be negative of the Russians, was clearly superior to the Ukrainians. And of course, you've got to add to that the intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capacity of the Russian war machine has improved drastically in order to aid the fighting man on the ground and to be able to hit areas with mass artillery, etc., etc. So we're not just giving it solely to Wagner, but Wagner fought what was a meat grinder battle in that place and won. So if you're running that outfit, what would you think? You'd think that you should get all the plaudits. But you don't. So now you're angry. Why am I not getting the plaudits? And we're still, as I said earlier on, they now want to disband me. Or, if you will, not necessarily disband me, but bring me into the greater army, which in a way is exactly the same, because what you're saying is, rather than make this look as though it's just my army that's done it, they now want to make it look as though the Russian military has done it by, it's kind of a General Zhukov play. You know, Zhukov, could have been a threat to Stalin, so let's get rid of him after the war ends. So this is what you do. He was a player, but he's not getting the respect that he should do. And that vanity is often played into by us trying to recruit people. So maybe he was recruited, or maybe somebody close to him was recruited and played on his vanity to say, you will get assistance, be it from the Ukrainians, might be the Ukrainian service that organised it and turned him, who knows, or be it from somebody else. So what I'm saying to you is that I could see that there was an intelligence service play on this whole issue. And if it's true about the meeting on Wednesday, 2 days before the events, 2.5 days before the events, then obviously the US, well, if that's why they came together, the US had an inkling of what might happen. And if it's true that already early Friday people were rounded up in Moscow before his activities could come to top fruition, then that suggests that the Russians also had some advance notice, either by somebody in the West who they turned, providing them with information, or in the Ukraine who they turned, providing them with information, or that the intelligence capacity in terms of the version of the NSA is sufficient for them to understand what was happening in the United States or in Britain or wherever else they got the information from. So you see, what I'm saying is I wouldn't just turn around and say that this was not. I don't know, disclaimer, don't know, but I would not say that there is not some potential intelligence play involved in this whole activity. So what was the want of the outcome, and what was the calculation? Because if you got your man in power and any of the other oligarchs that he's supposed to have been speaking to, because I haven't made it clear so far that actually Putin is propagating the war in a manner that many people don't like. They don't think he's hard enough. So had this thing been a coup and had it taken over, I would suggest you could imagine an even stronger attack on the Ukraine, no holds barred potentially, and a proper bloodbath, including bloodbath of civilians. If that's the case, why would Western intelligence agencies support that? And this is where we get to the duplicity of warfare, if it is the case. Because, of course, what you then get is the Russians trying to take over the whole of the Ukraine. And if they try to take over the whole of the Ukraine, they will be bogged down in a quagmire of warfare for the next 15, 20 years. Because you will have Ukrainian, basically insurgents, fighting an insurgency war against them in the Western Ukraine, definitely. So maybe the calculus was, from the neocons, that either way, it works. So if your man goes in and gets taken out, Prigozhin and his armies, and it doesn't work and the coup falls away, Putin looks weak. And it may push Putin to do what Prigozhin wanted him to do and actually take over and go across the Dnieper River and start taking over parts of Western Ukraine. We win. If he doesn't, he looks weak. We win. If he doesn't, and actually there is support in Moscow and the hardliners come into place, we win. But you see, for me, that's a short-sighted perspective. Because yes, it uses a whole lot of Ukrainian lives, which I don't think really bothers people so much. But what it also does is, it brings the miscalculation closer. Up to now, what has happened is that Zelensky has in some ways been the tail wagging the dog. It's what I call the blanco check of the First World War. The blank check, which was given to the Austrians. If you don't watch it, what will happen is that some action will be taken by the Ukrainians that will bring about conflict between NATO direct and Russia direct. Because as long as this goes on, that's more and more the case. That is highly likely. And then who knows where that ends? Because the United States has always said, and I'll use the US, if it looks as though our nation is going to be taken over, we will use nuclear weapons to destroy whomever it might be. Why would the Russians think any different? Remember what I said to you, think what the other guy thinks. Why would they think any difference? If it looks as though it's an existential threat to the livelihood of Russia, why would they not use what they've got? It's ultra dangerous game being played here, ladies and gentlemen. Ultra dangerous mischief being made. We've got to be very, very careful what we're doing. Now, some of you listening might think, oh, this fella's going over the top, nuclear war. No. What happens oftentimes, people fall into actions. They fall into mistakes. They fall into problems. And it's very hard to stop that. JFK learned this. If you listen to some of JFK's speeches after the crisis in Cuba, you can see that he's no longer bellicose. You can see he knew how close he was because he fell into an action that could have meant Third World War. And this is as close as it's ever been as well. So I think people need to understand that. People seem to think that intelligence services, militaries, have absolute control. Oh, this is what we're doing. It's A to B to Z. I'm sounding like an American. A to B to Z. It's all working through. No, that's not the way it works. What happens is it's always catch up. Because you figure something out, you figure out your operation. I've done hundreds, maybe thousands of operations. Figure out how it's going to work. And then you have to figure what's B, C, D, E. What are you going to do in this circumstance? I know 9 times out of 10 I'm referring to protection operations, but I'm also referring to intelligence operations and security operations. What's going to happen if it don't work that way? So it's not a given, ladies and gentlemen. It is not a given. It's dangerous, and we've got to watch what we're doing here. It's extremely dangerous. And I'll put it this way. You're now getting Hungarians asking for a full, independent investigation of what happened in Nord Stream 2, 1 and 2 to be fair. What happened? What was the result? Who blew it up? I know who I think blew it up, and any thinking person knows who you think blew it up. And it ain't Russia. You don't spend X amount of billion to build a pipeline and then you blow it up yourself. Because if you don't want to let that gas go to Germany, just shut it off. Shut the gas off, don't let it go. Why would you blow it up? In fact, the person who is the greatest architect of the war on the side of the United States, Miss Newland, she said that would be destroyed if Russia enter the Ukraine. So how could she say something? And indeed, the president also said that, didn't he? The president also said that pipeline will not come into play. Now, of course, who's been scapegoated for that but the Ukrainians? Supposedly some Ukrainian 6-man team who's gone out and there's been a boat there, etc., etc., etc. My point is this, and why I bring that up, is because can Europe turn a blind eye to it if the Hungarians get their way and if the evidence comes up that it was not a Ukrainian 6-man team, which is now what they're trying to say it is. Before it was meant to be the Russians, but that didn't stick because of Seymour Hersh and his information that's been actually getting some traction in the United States, so they had to change it. So if an investigation shows that it was the United States or other allies who were involved in that, how does that sit? Because it's clearly an act of war, which is what the Hungarians are saying. So what I'm saying to you is that these are the bits that are coming off the NATO all shining car. Little bits are falling off it now and then. You know, Turkey not wanting Sweden in. Turkey coming very, very close now once again to Russia. All little bits falling off the NATO vehicle, right? You know, Poland opened its arms to Ukrainians. Now all of a sudden you're getting parts of the Polish populace saying, hang on, these people are taking our jobs, houses, etc., etc. The way it goes, you know how it is. Romanians saying, well, we've not solved the problems with the Ukraine as we saw it. Those Western Ukrainians didn't want us teaching people in Romanian in the western part of the Ukraine. They wanted only to speak to them in Ukrainian. We couldn't have our schools teaching them in Romanian. We're stopping them to use our Romanian language. So you see, these are the bits and baps that are coming off. So as long as this thing goes on, the more and more there are delicacies that are falling away, and the more and more I think when Zelensky asks for more, the public opinion turns around and says, give him more. You're saying it's existential, you're saying it's super dangerous, you've made us support Ukraine, so give the Ukrainians everything they want. Why are you not doing that? By the way, that is counterproductive in a way, giving people weapons systems that they don't understand. With weapon systems, you want muscle memory. You want to be able to work that weapon system, be it a gun or an aircraft, to such an extent. This is why the pilots fly their aircraft and again and again and again and again and again. So when it comes into warfare, it's muscle memory they use to fly that aircraft and be in combat, or to shoot that gun or whatever. We used to practice all the time, drawing, shooting very extremely fast on a specific weapon system. On a specific weapon system. And then when it was an assault rifle we were using, on a specific weapon system for that assault rifle. So when you had to use it, if you had to use it, it was muscle memory. You didn't need to think about it. You just, bang, you knew where it went. You knew what you were going to do with it. That's what soldiers need to do. You don't want to go into a Bradley fighting vehicle having had 2 weeks on it and then figure out how does it work and press the wrong buttons when you're being under fire. That's not what you want. So just giving people, or Leopard tank or whatever it might be, giving people weapon systems that they're not familiar with and not capable of repairing, etc., where the technology is much greater than what they've been used to, is counterproductive. But this is what we've told our public individuals need, and this is what Zelensky's telling people they need, right? Because it sounds as though these are wonder weapons. They're not. They're only as good as the people who utilise them. So I understand with the Patriot system that they're now utilising that on automatic. Whereas the Americans who utilise that system realise that it's not as, let's say, as competent as it's been made out to be by the makers of the weapon. Take into account these weapons cost, for a full battery costs $1 billion. So the company making, I think it's Raytheon, who makes the weapons, obviously want to sell that weapon system. 90 people run it, right? And so what generally they tend to do, the Americans who've been trained on it, is actually utilise it in a manual manner because they know how it then functions. But the ones that have been used in the Ukraine, they've been used on automatic. So as soon as something's gone, bum, 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 you fired off all your tubes and nothing's been hit because they don't know the system. They've been taught on it, but been taught on it in a very short period of time. The guys who use it in the US military have been taught on it for years. Then you've got the people who fix it. Then you've got the people who maintain it. Then you've got the people who upgrade it. You can keep going on and on and on. This is what military weaponry is about. It's not about just one guy. It's about everything behind that one guy that is required. It's like a weapon. You've got an armourer who makes sure that the weapons are still functioning. Basic weapons. I'm talking about a gun now, so a basic gun, right? For an aircraft, it's a whole crew of individuals who need to keep the aircraft flying. Well, if you just train the pilot, what about all the crew? Or are you using Western crews? And then you've got NATO crews in the conflict. Even if they're the ground crew, they're now in the conflict. So I'm going to leave it here because I just wanted it to be a relatively short process. But I wanted to hit on, first and foremost, the incident, what happened over the weekend. I wanted to give you the political spin around it, what it may or may not be, because as I said before, I'll articulate again, I clearly cannot know fully. But I can give you my perspective on it. And then I wanted to come into the war and to see how that might change the war and how it might function. And then I wanted to look at the propaganda that's going on about saying easy victory for the Ukrainians. And I wanted to dispel that myth. And if I am wrong, and I've been saying this for a year now, great. When it happens, good for the Ukrainian. But as I see it now, I feel Ukrainians are dying wantonly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. I hope this has explained some of the issues around what has been happening recently in the war. And I'll see you again, or hopefully you'll listen to me again, on another subject next week. Bye-bye.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening And don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
In the quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.